Hello and welcome to this presentation of Extreme Beliefs or Delusions, Understanding the True Believer. This has been a very curious 12 months, some of the most chaotic, some of the most distressing in US history. If we think back over the last 12 months, we had catastrophic wildfires along the entire West Coast, stretching from the borders of Mexico to Canada. We had devastating storms in the Gulf Coast, some of the most significant damaging storms and a record-setting hurricane season. At the same time, the United States experienced some of the most dramatic episodes of civil unrest that we've had in nearly 2 decades. Some of the most costly, some of the most damaging, some of the most destructive civil unrest in US history. All of this, of course, was against the backdrop of a global pandemic, which has resulted in catastrophic losses of life here in the US and abroad, with tens of millions of people sickened by this infection. We've also been through one of the most divisive and difficult political seasons, much of which continue to this very day. In this environment, it actually creates the sort of incubation, this sort of fertile ground for conspiracy theories, for different sorts of extreme beliefs that we actually have seen result in violence in some of our communities, and to some degree resulting in the civil unrest at the US Capitol on the 6th of January in 2021. If we haven't met before, my name is Steve Cremando. I'm a 32-year-old veteran emergency behavioral health clinician and educator. I work half of my time for state government in New Jersey, where I'm the director of training for the disaster and terrorism branch in the New Jersey Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services. The rest of my time, I work consulting and training for various federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force, different organizations, again, across the law enforcement and intelligence community, but also at international organizations such as the United Nations. All of my work is focused on human behavior in crisis conditions. And one of the behavioral aspects that really is so difficult to understand and tricky to get ourselves around as practitioners across all the behavioral scientists, including those of you who are providing direct clinical services, is really understanding and differentiating in times like this, the difference between what is an extreme belief that may be protected thought or protected speech under our constitutional values, and what actually may be a delusion, which may be significant and indicating a greater psychopathology and perhaps be symptomatic of a psychotic process. Let me tell you just a little bit about my story and how I became interested in delusions and conspiracy theories. So given the nature of the work that I just described with you, working for FEMA, Homeland Security, the FBI and such, for about 25 to 30 years, working on some of our most significant cases in the US, ranging from the Unabomber case to Oklahoma City and right up to present day counterterrorism cases, I am associated with, and a lot of my writing, a lot of my lecturing, a lot of my materials, again, speak about these topics and have been done conjointly with these different agencies. In the summer of 2013, I was traveling and someone contacted with me and asked me if I could provide a photograph for a flyer for an upcoming presentation I would be doing. I was on the road, I didn't have access to my files. I asked if they could give me a little while to get online and look through Google Images and find a picture that would be suitable for their needs. And on Google, I typed in my name and instantly pulled up dozens of websites that went by the name or went by the phrase, Stephen Cremando, false flag. And I wasn't at that time familiar with the expression. A false flag is a term given to an incident perhaps that the US government or another government may stage, some sort of catastrophe that would be attributed to an adversary as justification for retaliation. I dug into these web pages and what I found was many of these pages, and some of them were neo-Nazi groups, there were websites for white supremacist groups, there were web pages for all sorts of conspiracy groups, all were saying exactly the same thing. They were reporting on a video made by a gentleman named David Laurie Vanderbeck, who at that time was running for governor of Nevada. And in the weekly broadcast that he put online, he mentioned the following, that the US government, specifically FEMA, would be staging one of these false flag attacks at a Boy Scout jamboree in West Virginia in the next months that would target and kill thousands of scouts and their families as a pretext for the US government to blame this on another government and maybe a cause for war. More specifically, Vanderbeck and all of the writing that just repeated his comments said that this attack would be done using chemical or biological weapons, but more to the point, it mentioned me by name as the person who was overseeing and creating this drill for FEMA. Now, to be clear, FEMA was never involved in anything of this sort, and I wasn't involved with anything of this sort as well. But it went on to mention me by name in several places, and in many of the other websites I found, there was a call for action. There were, bulletins that said, "This man, Steve Cremando, he must be stopped." So I quickly became someone dragged into the center of one of these conspiracies by some very, very extremist sorts of ideologies and groups who were calling for action and calling for me to be stopped. You can imagine that I, my family, my colleagues took this very seriously, and it was a very curious summer waiting that out in 2013. So I got to learn both about the technical and the clinical sides of conspiracy theories and of, again, these kind of far extreme viewpoints up close and personal, not just academically as I had before, by being kind of central to one of these false flag conspiracies or rumors. So let's talk about this then. In our modern time, this is again now 7 or 8 years later, we're still in another phase of really active conspiracy theories, and it can be very difficult for a clinician, it can be very difficult for any of us to distinguish between what is just an extreme belief that may be protected speech and what may be actually a delusion that may be indicative of greater psychopathology. For a point of clarifications, please consider throughout my entire presentation that nothing that I share in the presentation is meant to question the civil rights of individuals, organizations for assembly or for free speech. And this is not to assess the validity or the credibility of any one of the groups or any individual's positions, their viewpoints, their belief systems. This is going to be very specifically a discussion about how delusions, conspiracy theories, and extreme beliefs can associate with extreme behavior, including dangerousness, how we understand that clinically, how we assess that, how we make sure that our clients, ourselves, our communities are safe in a time of heightened activity around these sort of conspiracy theories and around some political violence that we have had and we probably expect to have in the next several months, if not longer. Now, in my program, I'll be using terms like right wing and left wing, but not in a way that speaks directly to political parties. So this hopefully is an apolitical, nonpartisan discussion. When I speak about extremists, and that will be the center point of our presentation, extremists are those in an ideology willing to use violence to either advance their belief or defend their belief. So these are people at the fringe. This is not even the mainstream extremist, as it were. These are violent extremists that I'm speaking of, and what we would refer to as violent true believers. On the right-wing side, we typically speak about ultra-nationalist groups, about white supremacist groups and neo-Nazi groups. We speak about misogynistic individuals and groups such as the incels. We talk about single-issue extremists such as animal rights extremists, again, extremist being the operative word, maybe anti-abortion extremists, environmental extremists, but individuals and groups who are willing to, again, use violence in defense of their cause. On the left wing extremists would involve those who typically align with socialist thought. So they are anti-government, anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, anti-globalism, and tend to be, again, pro-social and get involved with a lot of social justice movements that are pushing back against racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and so forth. We typically refer to these groups as anarchist groups, but we'll speak more about that as we go. This, of course, is a more significant challenge in an open democratic society that values and protects free speech. In other authoritarian countries, believe me, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And again, we would not have the sort of protest that we very often do. But realize that in an open democracy, it could actually be more difficult to make that distinction because we do allow and we actually promote all types of ideas and all types of speech. So the tough part becomes around assessing from a clinical standpoint, assessing from a violence prevention standpoint, where someone may be creeping up to the line or stepping over the line where they're actually inciting or creating violence. And for our sake, clinically, there's some things that really have changed over the last 2 decades that put the mental health professional more at the really crossroads of these issues and in a very, very important place to help detect and potentially deter acts of dangerousness or violence that do have an ideological root. Now, one of our best known theorists in terrorism studies is Bruce Hoffman. Bruce, in a very recent article in Security Management magazine, had said that the pandemic actually has created, the ultimate sort of petri dish for extremist thought and conspiracy theories to grow and to thrive, whether they're xenophobic, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic, and so forth. This is the kind of environment that really creates this nurturing growth bed of what he calls, again, this grist for the mill in our current political and ideological environment. Here I'm taking from the same article, Christine Miller-Indris, who had said that we have another compounding variable, which is so many people are isolated right now. Isolated in part because of the public health emergency, the pandemic, and isolated again almost generationally with people who are more inclined to spend more time isolated and on their screens, perhaps less socializing than others. In these environments where people again have this sense of isolation or disconnected from each other in some ways and are fed information or misinformation that can really ignite conspiracy theories and extreme beliefs, we have somewhat of a powder keg environment. Now, as I mentioned, the last 2 decades have been very transformational in the nature of extremist and terrorist violence. And I will make the distinction in just a few moments of how we would use the terms terrorist and extremist in different ways. But let's think back to 2001 in the wake of 9/11. In the wake of that event, US and most governments worldwide got very busy cracking down on organized groups and cells of terrorists. Back in that time, most terrorism was perpetrated here in the US by foreign terrorist organizations. So we're talking initially about Al-Qaeda and then on to the development of ISIS and so forth. And here in the States, there was some element always of domestic violence that's always been a bit of an undercurrent. But what's changed over time is in response to our security measures, hardening of cockpits, changing flight security, changing all kinds of security in our society, terrorism has become decentralized. So today, most people involved in extremist violence or terrorism are not associated with an organization per se. So back in the day, someone might travel to a faraway country, they might meet the leaders of the organization, receive funding, receive training, receive instructions, and return to the US to execute some sort of operation. Today, most actors are lone actors. Very often the term had been used of lone wolves. We've somewhat stopped using the term lone wolves because it tends to romanticize this idea, and most people are not lone wolves. In my work, I've actually worked on one lone wolf case over 32 years, and it was actually Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Kaczynski, living in a cabin in the high mountains of Montana, totally off the grid, disconnected from society, actually was a true lone wolf. Our lone actors today typically live and work in our communities, and they're known to other people, but they're acting independently. They may be inspired by other groups, they may be enabled by other groups, but they're not necessarily being directed by other groups. So back in the day, when most terrorism was group terrorism, there was this concept of the selection effect. And the selection effect essentially meant that if an individual with any evidence of mental illness really did show up and try to join one of these terror groups, the group typically refused them, selected them out, out of concerns that they would be a greater operational risk. They might not be able to execute on their task. They may speak out of school and give away secret information and really, destroy or damage the security of the organization. But today, most terrorist and extremist actors are alone. They are lone actors. And in this new environment, because of the absence of that selection effect, what we find in the research, and I will cite that research and give you the journal citations throughout the program, is that many more of these individuals do have evidence of a mental illness, and many of them have been diagnosed and many of them have been in or out of treatment. In fact, two key statistics here is we think lone actor terrorists are 13.5 times more likely to have a mental illness than a group-based terrorist. And when we study lone actor terrorists, they typically, about 30 to 35% of that very special population, again, has evidence of mental illness. Now, you'll notice in this next to last bullet point that number jumps up to 52%, more than half, when we talk about single issue extremists. So this may be the anti-abortion extremist, the animal rights extremist, the environmental extremist, and so forth. But more than ever, our population of arrested, detained, and interviewed terrorists and extremists do have evidence of mental illness more so than they ever have before. What this means is they're more likely to have contact with the system, with the law enforcement community, with the mental health care system, with the acute care system at our hospitals. These people are very often more likely to be known and recognized because of their involvement in mental health care treatment, and individuals, again, who are on that pathway, that we may be able to create off-ramps where this, again, reduces the likelihood of them acting on a extreme belief, acting on a delusion, or acting just in step with an ideology that's promoting violence. Now, for our presentation, and this is not completely unique to me, but it's a small and evolving discipline or sub-discipline in psychology. Although I was trained in clinical psychology, I work today primarily in operational psychology. And operational psychology is the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological ideas for their tactical or operational value. Now, these ideas also have a value in assessment, diagnosis, and treatment in a clinical environment. But I'm going to leave that more to you to interpret it through your lens, where these ideas could be useful in your day-to-day practice and in your work. But I want to make a very quick distinction. Some of you are familiar with the term PSYOPs, or psychological operations, which are very often used by the military, and that is not what I'm speaking about today. Those tend to be offensive operations. They're things that we often refer to as psychological warfare. They're meant to provide misinformation or made to destabilize an audience or a region. That is not at all what we're discussing. Operational psychology is a recognized subspecialty by the APA, American Psychological Association. It's an evolving discipline. There's one doctoral program that I know of so far. There's a number of textbooks written, but it's fairly new as a discipline, but it seeks to help our national security structure understand the psychology and the behavior of individuals who may be on a pathway to violence. Now, some of those individuals, again, on that pathway, may be extremists. And we're going to start talking about the extremists as true believers, of people who, again, strictly adhere to the tenets of a particular religious or ideological doctrine. That's not a bad thing, of course. That's someone very committed and devout, but really attached to it in a very, very strong way. And some of those beliefs are likely to be irrational and persistent. The problem, though, with the true believer, that's just a true believer, and anyone's welcome to be a true believer, is that we have a subset, which we're going to refer to as violent true believers. And again, the violent true believer is the individual who is willing to use violence to either defend their belief or advance their belief. Now, when we really started looking at this as a science, in the behavioral sciences, a lot of the work really was done through a psychoanalytic lens. And there was a lot of discussion of not just cognition and ideation, but of fantasies about defenses, object relations, moral functioning, and a lot of the more psychoanalytic sort of concepts. So our inquiry into this topic actually can and does fit very well with a psychoanalytic sort of mindset. But as I said, this is increasingly challenging right now because we're in a very different communications, media, and political environment than any of us have been in our lifetime. We're the first generation of clinicians and counselors who are having to consider these ideas as they get amplified in a social media environment, as they get promoted by very partisan, both political parties and media outlets. We're in a really, really interesting and dynamic space. And there's not a lot of literature. There's not a lot of science behind this because it's all new. No one in the early writings really could have envisioned really the effect that social media may have in recruiting or retaining or mobilizing extremists. Now, when we're discussing the idea of terrorism and extremism, it is important to make a little bit of a distinction because these terms can be used interchangeably, and there are times when they are actually interchangeable. But terrorism and extremism are slightly different in some important ways. So when we think about terrorism, first to know, there's not one universally accepted definition, and that, of course, makes things tricky right away. Different countries, governments, even different states have defined terrorism in different ways. But there are some things that are universally accepted as differentiators between terrorism and extremism. Terrorism involves the use or threat of use of violence. It is inherently political in its nature. It is perpetrated by non-state actors. That means not military, right? So these aren't soldiers who are committing these attacks. These are someone who's not associated with the government. And they typically intentionally target non-combatant populations, largely, as you know, to have a psychological effect, not just on those people targeted, but on the larger audience, to create fear, to manipulate fear, a type of fear we refer to as ambient fear. Ambient fear that's always operating in the background and really influencing everything that we think and we do. When we start to speak about extremism, then, this is slightly different. It's holding on to an extreme ideology or belief, and it could be political or religious or otherwise, but not just the belief system, the more extreme aspects of this belief, and that kind of differentiates you from the mainstream believers. Not all terrorists are extremists. Think about someone who lives in an occupied country or an occupied territory, and everyone in their culture, everyone in their community has the same belief that they should be really able to self-determination and self-rule, and they've run out of ways to do that. And now they fall into a place where they believe violence is the only and the last resort to achieve self-determination. The belief in self-determination in that community is in no way extreme. But the belief to use violence to achieve it starts to create the violent extremist. So this individual or group may employ terrorist tactics and terrorist methods. That's violence, political violence against non-combatants, as we explained in the last slide. But not all terrorists are extremists. Their viewpoints can be very accepted in the larger community. It can be very moderate views. And all extremists are not terrorists. Think about someone who is an extreme pacifist. They're an extremist in their ideology. They're maybe even way beyond the mindset of most other pacifists, but they're not going to be inclined to use terrorism or violence in many means. So there are places where terrorism and extremism overlap, but they're not a one-to-one sort of correlation. Now, a trick for us, of course, as clinicians, as counselors, as academics perhaps, is to help differentiate when we are speaking to or listening to an extremist or that true believer or even violent true believer, how we differentiate what is just that extreme belief, might even be, as I said, protected speech from our constitutional, sort of protections, and what actually may be delusional that might suggest psychopathology, may suggest a psychotic process or thought disorder, and so forth. How do we distinguish between them? Well, let's make a distinction, first of all, between extreme belief and what we're going to go on to call extreme overvalued beliefs. Now, these ideas are not necessarily new. The term extreme overvalued belief actually derives from the idea, overvalued idea, who was introduced by the German neuropsychiatrist Karl Wernicke back in 1892. This is much more than 100 years then really in the making, and even included in the DSM is spoken about as a less than delusional intensity of an idea that's not shared by others. So that's kind of how this has evolved over time. But then we get into our current realm and we start to speak about something different, extreme overvalued beliefs. That's more pronounced. We start to talk about the idea as actually being shared, the core idea being shared by a larger group or culture, but the person we're speaking about has taken it to the next level. So the belief, typically as the person espouses it, gets amplified, it gets defended, it's valued by the community, people champion this, but then there's a tipping point where it actually could spill over into obsession and into delusion. Now, here, the differentiation is that it's held by many people, but our person, the extreme overvalued belief, is actually outside the core. So if you were to look at this graph with me for a second, what you see is a larger bubble of extreme beliefs, and that's the larger community that holds this ideology. There are many people within that. You see the smaller bubble that's almost entirely inside the larger, kind of in the 7 o'clock position here, that we're going to call extreme overvalued beliefs. These are people in the larger extremist community who hold the most extreme beliefs, but those extreme beliefs, for the most part, are consistent with the beliefs of the larger group. They're just more intense. So you see an almost complete overlap of these two circles. But when you move across to delusions, what you notice is the vast majority of that bubble is outside, is not ideas held by the larger group, but there is a little area of overlap. So it's kind of that kernel of truth, or that, that anchor for them that they could still associate with an ideology, with a belief system. But there's many people in the belief system that don't even want to have anything to do with folks who are that delusional, because they think it discredits the belief and they think it may actually be dangerous. And they're right in some instances. Let me give you an example. Back in 1995, with the bombing of the Oklahoma City federal building there, Timothy McVeigh, the bomber, his co-conspirator, Terry Nichols, both were members, had joined a militia group in Michigan. They were attending meetings, and whenever they would start really speaking about the need for violent overthrow of the US government, it made the rest of the militia members really uncomfortable, to the point where they were actually expelled from that group. Now, those were people who held pretty extreme beliefs. They needed to be ready and armed and trained up to fight back the tyranny of our federal government. There were people in that group who were extreme in their belief in what they were doing. And then there were people who they thought were outside the bubble, like McVeigh and Nichols, who were actually pushed from the group. And we've seen this in a number of instances. Now, one thing you have to remember is, if we think about those who are delusional, that delusion may, it's not the only reason, but may certainly be the byproduct of psychosis. And that psychosis could be, of course, organic. It could be telltale of a mental illness. It could be drug-induced and otherwise. There's a number of reasons for that, but this person now has a fixed delusion, and usually one that's very angry. When we look at this, when we study this, we know that we could have individuals who are actually floridly psychotic and still functional enough to organize and plan and train and execute a very sophisticated attack. I go back to my idea with the Unabomber. We could think of a few others over time: Anders Breivik and Utoya and Oslo, Norway, who I'll mention in a few moments. All were people who the courts could have easily declared as insane. Both instances, they rejected the insanity plea. They didn't want their, quote, believers to question their validity. So they didn't opt for that, but certainly met the diagnostic criteria. So we have individuals who may be psychotic and actually could still organize and execute a very, very devastating sort of attack plan. So we will have people in this gray zone who can be delusional because of a psychotic process. And we're going to talk about the correlation between psychosis and dangerousness in just a little while. We have people who could be in that gray zone, be this extreme, violent, true believer, be this, have those overvalued or extreme overvalued belief systems that have teetered over into delusional space and still be able to act on that delusion. Now, when we think about our current era, and this is not absolutely unique to our time, but given our social media capabilities and other, other ways we communicate, conspiracy theories are able to move and reach a lot more people a lot more quickly than they historically have. Now, when we think about these true believers or even the violent true believer, many of them can be associated with conspiracy theories, but certainly not all. So when we think about this, conspiracy theories can really add rocket fuel to the ideology of that violent true believer. And one of the things we know about conspiracy theories most often is they have a very significant paranoid quality. Usually that there are dark forces at work in the world and the governments that are damaging all of us or after us in some way that need to be stopped. So what we know about paranoia and dangerousness or violence is that many instances or individuals or groups will act preemptively to stop an individual or a group if they believe that they represent a risk of doing harm. Certainly that was my big concern in the summer of 2013, when there were literally dozens and dozens of websites that mentioned me by name as being someone who was going to do grave harm to thousands of innocent Boy Scouts and their families at a camping event. So this paranoia, as I said, can come from a number of different instances, but we know it does have an association with dangerousness and with violence. When we think then about conspiracy theories, also starting to understand the psychology of the individual, I'm going to start at the bottom of this slide with this quote from Post, who said, "The cause is not the cause," meaning the ideology, the belief system, is not necessarily the cause for the person's movement towards radicalization or towards violence. Very often, the true believer themselves does not have a clear idea of why they think and why they feel this way, but they've created in their mind justification for the use of violence in defense of their ideology or to advance the ideology, and this all makes sense to them, and it seems urgent to do. So Mark Sageman had said in 2008 that many of these violent true believers don't actually know what their true motivations are. I'd like you, if you could, to hold on to this idea through the program that through this lens, we view violence as a process, not as an event. We're speaking about the sort of violence in which people don't just snap. They move over a timeline through various phases and stages that we refer to today as the pathway to violence towards this ultimate act. There's a lot of different dynamic factors, psychodynamic factors that create this environment where the person is in a smoldering crisis, but not necessarily a sudden crisis. So let's give you an example of that by looking at what's referred to as the radicalization to mobilization pathway. Now, this is a shortened version for our discussion today, but let's start on the left side of this graphic and move our way across. In the pre-radicalization phase, we have an individual who has some inclination or vulnerability to these messages. They may be an acceptance seeker, someone who feels powerless, someone who feels they're looking for something to latch onto, to give them meaning and purpose in life, to feel that they're accepted, that they belong, all these different reasons, similar to gang indoctrination, similar to joining crime networks, things of this nature. So we have someone who is looking for something, and they find it. They find it maybe on themselves, and very often that's on the internet to them today. The older model was simply known as I met a guy, and I met a guy at the gym. I met a guy at the store. We were talking. He introduced me to these ideas. So people, again, start to be introduced to these ideas, and maybe a small subset of these people start to convert to this as their main way of believing. And lots of people stop just right there. They just adopt this belief system. But a smaller subset yet go on to become really to start identifying themselves with this belief system. So, hi, my name is Steve. I am a fill in the blank. And they describe themselves and they think of themselves as a member or a believer in this ideology. It starts to define who they are. But what they start to realize, both themselves and through others, is if you truly are a true believer, true believers don't sit on their hands. True believers take action. So there's this call for action that starts to move them further along to this next phase we refer to as indoctrination, where the person is now convinced that violent action is necessary. And they immerse themselves with others of a similar mindset. They could be others in a belief system online. It could be that Facebook group. It could be people at a rally or a march. It could be people just communicating in direct messages or some way. But they start again to immerse themselves and strengthen that social identity that this is who they are. And more important, this is what they must do. So not only is there a deep conviction now, but there's a readiness for action. And a smaller number yet, but still a significant number, are likely to move on to action, where they knowingly engage in extremist activity, planning, preparing, and executing some sort of act. And that typically does meet the criteria for terrorism. Look, please, if you would, at the bottom of this slide with me for a moment. Important definitions. Radicalization is a change in opinion states, attitudes, beliefs, ways of thinking. Mobilization is a change in action states. So here we're looking at a pathway from becoming radicalized into an ideology to becoming an actor on behalf of that ideology. Now, I know and you know that the prediction of dangerousness is, an imperfect art and science. And we also know that, we're limited in our tools of how we assess and what we assess. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this because we're getting better in some ways. But the thing that's been universal and consistent for decades now is we recognize that behavior and communication are the best window we have into someone who may be moving along this pathway and moving along towards violence. We know there is no useful profile of an individual on this pathway to violence, but there are very significant commonalities between those who move along to extreme acts of violence. From a psychoanalytic perspective, as I said, most of the early writing on extremism and terrorism was done through a psychoanalytic lens. The consistent themes that we hear through that lens are that we're talking about individuals with a pathological narcissism as really defining their self-structure and really having a very primitive mode of thinking. These individuals have a lot of problem forming normal attachments, really, again, impaired in terms of meaningful long-term relationships. And that can be with partners or peers or coworkers and so forth. And their relationships tend to be very much driven by that narcissism. The violent true believer, as we dig in deeper, really is fueled by this grandiose, omnipotent sort of fantasy that they could take on the government. They could be a leader. They could fire that next shot in the second American Revolution. All of those very lofty, grandiose sorts of beliefs. So what you get is a very primitive, kind of pre-edible, internal world for the person, really difficult problems with object relations. And the person tends to be governed in their day-to-day interactions with people by really problematic defenses such as splitting and denial and projection, rather than what we would hope for is more mature defenses like repression or sublimation. So you've got someone who's struggling, but gets connected with these ideas that start to fuel that narcissism and give them even a greater sense of power. So the power is very raw. And you can think back to scenes you've seen of newscasts over the last months, wherever we've seen, really violence. Very, very powerful, what we refer to as primitive affects, such as shame, rage, disgust, are primary, and a lack of the more mature affects, such as remorse or empathy or joy. And all this, very much impairs the person. And this is why I said many of these people do end up being known to the mental health care system or sometimes getting involved themselves. Problems with affect regulation, difficulties with object relations, again, are very, very significant here. And the person themselves, and you're going to hear this throughout my program today, is characterized by this rigidity, okay, and this concreteness in their thinking, and a desire for simplicity in their thinking and their understanding, and certainty. So think of where I started. The year 2020, the wildfires, the hurricanes, the civil unrest, COVID-19, political chaos breeds tremendous uncertainty. And here, at a deep personality level, we're speaking about someone who just is thirsty for some sense of certainty. And this concrete thinking is a way that actually helps them form a closure around some of the uncertainty and all the anxiety that comes from this. So what we think about from a psychoanalytic standpoint is someone who starts to see themselves as a warrior. And we're going to speak about that in a very specific way in a few moments. A warrior on behalf of their belief or cause, even to the point of martyrdom. And that's not unique to foreign terrorism or jihadist extremism. We see this across all the different ideologies in their most extreme forms. Now, these fantasies, again, actually at a neuropsych level, as well as, in terms of psychodynamics, create a sense of pleasure, of meaning, of glory, and they're fueled by this sense of, one, personal grievance and moral outrage. And what the person does, and we see this reflected in the last statement here, is they find a snippet, find a kernel of truth somewhere that helps give them the moral authority to take action. So if we were to look at foreign terrorism, maybe within Al-Qaeda or within in ISIS, we'll find people who are true believers, and they have found moral justification in the teachings, in the holy books, and maybe some cleric has pointed to them that they have been interpreting these writings incorrectly. Let me teach you what they really say, and give them an extreme interpretation that justifies violence. In the far right domestic violence sphere, we look at people who are absolutists to the Constitution, maybe something like the Second Amendment, who say, if you read the Constitution correctly about the right to bear arms, we should be able to do this everywhere. So we're marching in the streets with AR-style rifles, and we're marching in tactical gear, and we look like we're ready for combat. So here, that way of being becomes very significant in defining who that individual is. So as we look at this more deeply from a psychoanalytic perspective, as we say, what kind of distinguishes the violent true believer from the common criminal, just anybody involved in predatory violence? Again, we'll spend some time making the distinction between predatory violence and affective violence in just a little while, is the moral sanctioning, that they could draw their inspiration and moral justification from something like a holy book, like the Constitution, some credible source, or even a cleric or an intermediary who interprets this doctrine for them. And what we have then is this, very super ego-driven aggression, where the violent true believer finds a mandate for violence. I must do this. And we hear folks, and it sounds obsessive, the perseveration, it sounds almost a compulsive sort of action of people who feel that they just absolutely have to commit this violence. Now, there's actually a very interesting neuropsych discussion to be had about what we refer to as altruistic punishment. And what we know about the true believer is, as this individual starts to really fantasize about executing their violence, and remember, in advancing their cause or defending their cause, it actually starts to create activity in the pleasure reward system of the brain. So this is the nucleus accumbens, this is the striatum. And what we know, looking here in different sorts of brain scans, MRIs, PET scans, and others, is we could see that neural pathway when people start to fantasize about what we refer to as altruistic punishment. So it's not violence for violence sake, it's violence because this must be done. The individual must be punished. You know, there's a correlation mentioned on the next slide between this sort of violence and school violence. We think about schools, we used to talk about the kid in the classroom who is a loner. And today we don't speak about the loner anymore. We think about the incompetent joiner. And the incompetent joiner is the kid who wants to be on the team, wants to get a date, wants to go to the dance, wants to be popular, but he or she's pushed away. They feel hurt. They feel so hurt that they must retaliate. And we know this underlies this retaliation, and this altruistic punishment underlies what we think about 40% of school violence. So a few things to notice on this slide. This neural link is especially dominant in males, especially prevalent in males. It's related to perceived wrongs or perceived injustices, and it revolves again around this idea of altruistic punishment. I also mentioned, as I said, highly correlated in studies of school violence. It seems to be, again, a theme in the commission of acts of terrorism as well. One thing I hope you noticed already in many of these slides is the citations to the various journals or textbooks that speak in greater depth about this have been included for you. So you can go back at any point and really do more of your research on this topic if you'd like. Now, many of the early writings on the psychology of extremists and psychology of terrorism were done exclusively through a psychoanalytic framework, speaking primarily about narcissism and relationships to the parents and so forth. And that's been expanded and modernized over time, but there's still a very meaningful conversation to be had from a psychoanalytic standpoint. Today, we look at it blending different kind of models and schools of thought. Including, as we said, the psychoanalytic framework. But we talk about individuals who at a very, very deep level have these vulnerabilities, have a need to find meaning or purpose or belonging or acceptance, and are driven towards these more extreme ideologies. So when we start to think then about why people become extremists, there's no one reason, as you'd imagine. It happens for a very deep personal sort of reason, but we can kind of look at those reasons in a structured way. Typically, there's some sort of lack in the person's life. There is a lack of meaning, a lack of connection that the person is trying to fill through being, connecting to others and others who seem powerful. So this creates a vulnerability for recruitment. Sometimes it's a very devout religious view or government policy that they oppose and so forth, but they wouldn't really take it to the extremes if there wasn't something really kind of, wanting or lacking in their structure. So we talk about this again then for a few moments from a social psychology perspective. And there's two good models here. We'll talk about the first, which is related to or called the 3 Ns. And the 3 Ns, as you see by the gears here, that interoperate with each other are the needs, the network, and the narrative. And we believe radicalization and ultimately movement to mobilization arises out of the interaction. At the needs level, it can be certainly more than one of these: honor, injustice, vengeance, social status, a desire to enter heaven or something of that nature, but it's a quest. So it's a quest for significance. That's the most important. So if you took all of those in the longer category, honor, humiliation, injustice, and so forth, and boiled them down, they all in one way or another condense down to quest for significance. The narrative is the story the person tells themselves and others start to tell them as well. That creates really a story of the trajectory, the arc of their life, the purpose and the meaning. It helps them identify their goals. It helps them really attain those goals, and validates them that they're not just a drifter. They're not someone with, who is all on their own in the world with such a unique viewpoint that no one else could relate and no one else can connect. So it is someone, again, who feels justification in that narrative provided by others or by self. And lastly, the network. And these are the people that the individual starts to connect with. Very easy today to connect primarily online. I mentioned earlier, it's a whole nother lesson plan to talk about the psychology of incels, involuntary celibates, but the group or the ideology, sometimes even spoken about as a movement, exists completely in a virtual environment. Nobody gets together. They are actually kind of pathological loners and, shut-ins for the most part. So these are not individuals who are going to do a lot of networking, but they are continually, and I mean day and night, in these virtual networks. So once a person forms their narrative, once they connect to others who have similar narratives and support them, this again starts to accelerate them potentially down that pathway. Another way to look at this is the three Ps rather than the three Ns, and this is push, pull, and personal factors. A very good kind of framework to think about. Please notice that the percentages I'm discussing here do not add up to 100% because any one individual may have one or more of these factors in play at any given time. Push is our response to our environment. So think about this individual maybe who lives in a war-torn country, feels a certain government is to blame for the recent drone strike on their village that has wiped out half their family, friends, and neighbors, feels oppressed, feels that it's inescapable poverty, and this grave injustice is done to them, but they have no resources. They don't have an army to fight back. They don't have fighter jets. They don't have the funding or any wherewithal to meaningful fight back against this oppressor or aggressor. Well, what comes to mind? Terrorism. These asymmetrical forms of warfare where now a roadside bomb is a way to retaliate. So in this way, we think about push factor, someone being driven or propelled towards this violence for a lack of any other way to, they believe, fight back. A pull factor is the opposite. It's an attraction too. So we think this is very cool. I think that I'm a teenage boy in Minnesota, and I see a number of people from my community have gone to Syria to join ISIS and join the fight. And I want to be like that. I want to have purpose and meaning in my life. I want to be a tough guy. I want to be a militant. I want to be someone who's at the forefront or the vanguard of creating this new culture. And this person is then pulled, attracted towards the cause or the belief system. And lastly, personal factors. And these can include psychopathology. They can include different mental health problems and substance problems and so forth, personality traits, traumatic life experiences. But there's something very unique to the individual that creates this sort of attraction to the environment or to the the battle space of the militant or the extremist. So these tend to work together, as I say. All of them tie back to those needs the individual has. They're all super interconnected. And they all can work simultaneously to move someone along from being radicalized to mobilized to being that violent actor. Now, there's another way to look at this again, and these are not mutually exclusive. We could adopt several of these different ideas, which would be through the lens of cognitive psychology. So I want to discuss two concepts quickly, which are cognitive openings and cognitive closing. Cognitive opening is the idea that the person has been exposed to or experiences a sudden traumatic or catastrophic life event that has helped them now step back and re-examine everything in their life, puts everything in a different perspective, really changes their worldview, and now they're open where they never would have adopted these ideas before or even listened to some of these extreme thoughts. There's an opening now for them to start to hear some different ways to think and act. For any of you who are responders to the 9/11 attack, to Ground Zero, myself, the first days and weeks and months that I was there, I think the feeling remained with me every day was just absolute disbelief that this could happen. And it certainly changed mine and probably everybody's worldview in some way. Certainly helped you reshape your perspective and your priorities in your life when you saw something that catastrophic, that devastating. So that was a kind of an example of a cognitive opening. When we think about the cognitive opening, they're subject to some sort of trigger event. There's a significant loss, there's a threat of a loss, but it also could be the promise of a significant gain. So the person's got this big opportunity. It's not always a negative occurrence, but some major event has happened that's created this opening in their thinking, a clearing of some of their defenses where they're much more vulnerable to these new ideas and their new thoughts. The idea of cognitive closure is the opposite of this. This is the person I spoke about earlier who has been struggling with the anxiety created from not knowing, just what you and I might think of as angst, the uncertainty of the world around us, which certainly has been very dramatic over the last 12 months, given world events, all the uncertainty. So what extremist ideologies offer people is absolutism. So you are with us or you're against us. You're a believer or you're a non-believer. The Constitution, there's no alternative reading of this. It says this. The religious scriptures of our faith, they say this and nothing else but this. So if you are someone who is really suffering from the anxiety of uncertainty, adopting one of these very concrete black and white ideologies actually closes that cognitive dissonance for you. It relieves some of the anxiety. It actually serves that purpose for the individual. Now, from a clinical psychology perspective, I did speak earlier in the presentation about some of the ways that the relationship or the nexus between terrorism and mental illness has begun to change over the last 2 decades. Now, this typically arises out of the interaction between the individual's personal life circumstances, different vulnerabilities, and perhaps aspects of mental illness that can play a role in this when we think about it from a clinical psychology standpoint. When we look at radicalization, and these are all, again, peer-reviewed journal articles and studies that look at this, when we have people who surrender, who are captured on the battlefield, who are arrested before, during, or after a terrorist attack. And we study this. This is a group of an N of 148 subjects. We see that, roughly between a quarter and close to a half of these lone actors historically have had some sort of diagnosable mental health condition. That number changes when we think about their affiliation to the group. It's a lone actor, it's a group-based terrorist, and so forth. And you'll see that in a few moments. But I want to be really careful, and I'm sure I'm literally preaching to the choir here for the next moment or two. We cannot conflate mental illness and violence. We know that most people with mental illness are not violent in any way. In fact, are more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of violence. So we do not want to add to the stigma of mental illness, somehow creating the perception that those who are mentally ill are more likely to become terrorists. That is not the mindset. It's almost the inverse. What my message is, those who have moved along a pathway towards terrorism and extremism, that's a very select subset of people in our world. That subset of people are more likely to have different sorts of mental illnesses, as you'll see. But this is not reflective of the larger population of individuals with mental illness who represent a significant part of our national and global population. So bottom line, again, if we go back to even the earliest studies like the MacArthur study, they all consistently tell us people with mental illness no more likely to be violent, actually more likely to be, as I said, victims than perpetrators. But when we get into the very small world of extremists and terrorists, we know things start to change statistically. For example, because of the absence of that selection effect that I mentioned earlier, the odds of an individual who's a lone actor of having a mental illness are 13.5 times greater than those who are involved in group-based terrorism. As I said, the group typically selects or screens that out. They have historically. That's changing, though, over time. So mental illness in this way is not causal, doesn't cause terrorism. Mental illness, though, may be a contributing factor in terms of the person's vulnerability and impulse control, judgment, incite, other sorts of issues like that may be compromised by an illness. So we can kind of intuitively understand this relationship. But mental illness is only one of many potential drivers. We also know that historically, large terrorist organizations, as I said, selected out individuals who seemed that they may have mental illness. There is some evidence that there's actually activity trying to recruit individuals today who may have more of a vulnerability because of their mental illness. Now, without reading each of these points here, if you really are inclined to, remember that you can go back and stop the slide here and linger on this to study it, or you could go to the work here of Emily Corner and Paul Gill and others in these studies that are cited, and you look at the prevalence of the different disorders, and some of them kind of make sense to us. But in this another study here, this is a study of 153 lone actors. Now remember, in the earlier slide where I mentioned the range was 26 to 40, those were all kinds of individuals involved with terrorism. Here we're talking specifically just about lone actors. 40% of them appear to have evidence of some sort of mental illness. That's a very, very significant number, much higher than the general population. And when we think about that, then we understand that this lone actor, because they may be isolated, they may be, spending much more time just fixated on these ideas, can get very, very quickly swallowed up or slide down these rabbit holes. The lone actor with a mental illness, though, even in a very grave mental illness, still has the same sort of capacity in most instances for planning and executing a viable attack plan. So we shouldn't in any way be lulled into a sense that someone would be so disturbed or even so psychotic that they couldn't act out and execute a plan. So again, I'd actually recommend this reading to you. You can see the hyperlink as well. This is a copy of the CTC Sentinel. This is the counterterrorism publication from West Point, the Combating Terrorism Center there. Very good article on the relationship of mental health and terrorism. Again, in these studies, 35 to 40% of lone actors have some form of mental illness, due essentially to their temperament, to social skills, to their mental health condition, become vulnerable to these messages and to radicalization. Now, there is a difference in how connected the individual is to others. The highest prevalence is actually, I mentioned this earlier, the lone actor who is part of a single issue cause like anti-abortion, animal rights or environmental rights and so forth. When we talk about lone actors, 40% of lone actors seem to have evidence of a mental illness. When we talk about solo lone actors, that sounds like almost the same thing, but the difference is a solo actor is someone who is associated with a terrorist group, but they're acting alone. The lone actor is not associated with any group. They may be inspired, they may be enabled, but they're not necessarily associated or a member of a group. So when we go from those who are all alone, 40%, those who are acting alone on behalf of a group, 20%, cut it in half. We go to people who are dyads. That would be the husband and wife team in San Bernardino, California, the two brothers in the Boston Marathon bombing, the Sarna brothers, the Karachi brothers, the attackers at Charlie Hebdo in Paris. That's a dyad. The numbers fall to 5%. And for those who are inside an organized terrorist group, 3%. So it makes a very, very big difference if the person is all alone and conjuring up these ideas and exposing themselves to these extreme sort of ideologies that pull them into this trap. So when we think about this, and this is going to sound maybe difficult to kind of reconcile, most group-based terrorists clinically present as psychologically normal, meaning that they're undistinguishable from the base population and their rates of psychopathology are similar to the base population. Then we get to the far extreme of this, I said, with someone like a lone actor who's inspired by a single issue, and they're more than half, 52% seem to have evidence of a mental illness. So this is really important when we're doing assessment of risk and such, and we're thinking about, it does matter what the person's belief system. It does matter if they're part of a group. It does matter what type of group or if they're acting alone. All of that speaks to our perception of the risk of dangerousness. So as I said, believe it or not, at a clinical level, those involved with group-based terrorisms look psychologically sound. The typical recruit usually does not have any sort of problems psychologically. They're not necessarily undereducated or impoverished. We know that many of the people, if we think about 9/11, were very well educated and some were very affluent, the attackers on that morning. Now, very important for us is the next core idea, which is the relationship of psychosis. And why are we on psychosis? Because we start out with the ideas of differentiating extreme belief from delusion. And of course, delusion may be symptomatic of a greater psychopathology of thought disorder or psychotic disorder. So let's look for a moment at the work of Douglas. Douglas, who's famous for meta-analysis, studies 204 clinical studies and finds that psychosis is the single greatest predictor of violent behavior. When someone is actually actively psychotic, the risk of violence exponentially starts to climb. But more important to us, and I really want you to take this home as a clinician and a counselor today, is when we see very specific sorts of psychotic features. For example, threat control override symptoms. Threat control override symptoms is a combination of factors in which the person simultaneously feels threat from the outside, paranoid or persecutory delusion, others are trying to get me, others are trying to kill me. So it's threat from the outside, and at the same time, a threat from the inside. The government is controlling my behavior with radio waves. They planted a microchip in my head. They're poisoning me. They're trying to kill me from the inside as well. When someone simultaneously feels threatened from the inside and the outside, they feel so trapped that the only natural response is to fight their way out. They believe they're under an existential threat. They're going to be eliminated. So we'll think then about threat control override as a very unique constellation of a type of psychotic presentation, but is super highly correlated with dangerousness. Let me go back one slide for a moment. I mentioned that Douglas had reviewed these studies and found psychosis as the single greatest predictor of violence. But beyond that, Swanson and his team find that when someone who is psychotic has threat control override symptoms, they are twice as likely than anybody else with psychosis to engage in violence. So this is very, very strong as an indicator for us. If you're listening to someone in which the delusion is about threat control override symptoms, the likelihood of dangerous behavior is very high. Here's a case example. It's one you may be familiar with. The individual in the picture is Aaron Alexis. Aaron Alexis was the shooter in the Navy Yard active shooter event in September 2013. Now, let me tell you the story just for a moment. Alexis had successfully served in the Navy. He was a computer technician in the Navy, and he was honorably discharged. When he was discharged, he still had a few years left on his national security clearance. So he took jobs with a number of defense contractors, and he was working up and down the East Coast, servicing Navy computers at different Navy yards and installations all along the Eastern Seaboard. In the summer of 2013, specifically the week between July and August, he is up in Newport, Rhode Island, and he's at the naval base there. He checks into a hotel room to start, working on Navy computer systems over the next few days. And within probably 15, 20 minutes of him checking into his room, the clerk at the hotel desk has to call Navy police and say, please come and help. This guy who just checked in is destroying his room. I don't know what's going on, but it's very violent in there. I hear yelling and screaming and all kinds of destruction. Navy police respond. Alexis has just thrashed his room. He's flipped the bed over because he thinks there's people hiding under it. He's taped microphones to the walls and the ceiling and the floor because of the voices coming through the floors and the walls and the ceiling. Obviously, very likely that these are psychotic. The police reassure him, Mr. Alexis, there's no voices. They recognize there's a likely mental health problem. And they refer him to the medical clinic, the VA clinic there on base. And he's seen in the emergency room where once they put his name in the computer, see that he's on a waiting list for his very, very first mental health appointment for his intake. And it's not going to be for weeks or months away. So they give him 10 trazodone to help him over. And he takes the meds and he starts to take them properly and the symptoms subside. And he finishes his assignment in Rhode Island. Heads down the coast to DC, starts his job, runs out of meds and the symptoms return, very paranoid. On his last day of work on the Friday afternoon, he stops at a sporting goods store on the way back to his hotel in Virginia, buys this Remington 870 pump action shotgun and takes it back to his hotel room, where he cuts the barrel short, he cuts the stock short, and he breaks it down, puts it in his backpack for Monday morning when he returns to work. Goes to the gate with his proper credentials, up to the 4th floor where he's working of this one main building. In the men's room, reassembles this gun, comes out guns blazing. He kills 12 and ultimately himself. Alexis is not a terrorist. Alexis is not an instance of workplace violence in its classic sense. Alexis is actively psychotic, experiencing threat control override symptoms, and terrified that the government is trying to kill him and he needs to fight back. In the FBI report that follows, they say Alexis has written, as this is on his computer, is being controlled and experienced by ELFs, the extreme low frequency radiation that the Navy uses to communicate with submarines thousands of feet below the surface. He knows how this works technically. And in his own writing, Alexis writes, ultra low frequency attack is what I've been subject to for the last 3 months. And to be perfectly honest, that is what's driven me to this, meaning the violence. On the receiver of his gun, with a nail, he is carved, "End the torment." On the side of the receiver, he is engraved, "My ELF weapon, better off this way." Alexis is experiencing threat control override symptoms, threatened from the outside, threatened from the inside, has nowhere to go but to fight. So when we look at delusions in general, there is certainly levels of these and types of these that should jump out at us as being more specific indicators of a risk of dangerousness or violence. I'll give you one further example just to finish this line of thought. This is from Kevin Lumbaugh in Davis, California. Kevin pedals up his bicycle behind a police officer who's on the side of the road writing a speeding ticket to someone. Out of his messenger bag, he pulls a handgun and shoots and kills this officer. And in his handbag, this note: the Davis Police Department has been hitting me with ultrasonic waves. I've been notified Internal Affairs, the FBI. I'm highly sensitive. I've tried to live with this for years, but I can't do it anymore. Last resort sort of thinking. So there are sadly countless examples of this from around the country and around the world, where this particular kind of delusion, sometimes combined with sensory perceptions, hallucinations that the person believes as well, are threatening to kill him, takes action preemptively. This is referred to as predatory sort of violence. Now, when we think about affective violence, that's something like road rage. That is the person who seems to just snap. And if you look at someone in an episode, for example, of road rage, you see a high level of autonomic nervous system arousal, heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, everything's just at the top of its peak. The person's just totally emotional, reacting to the moment, just a real scattered hot mess. When we talk about those people that I'm discussing today on the pathway towards violence, we're speaking about predatory violence. And when the person is involved in that violence, very little autonomic nervous system sort of arousal, very calm, very focused, very calculated. This is not reactive to the moment. It's being planned, it's purposeful, and there's many different motives inside that are driving someone towards this kind of violence. For the person involved in road rage, it's time limited. You can only kind of sustain that level of anger for so long, but it's very public. The person acting out wants everyone to know how angry they are, what a jerk you are for taking their parking spot or whatever the perceived offense is. And they are, as I said, a hot mess, scattered, diffuse. They're all over the place. If you were to ask them later what they said, what they did, probably have a difficult time remembering. But the predator is not time limited. I mentioned Anders Breivik before in Oslo, Norway. He told us in court testimony, 7 years in the making, his plans, and others have talked about weeks, months, years of planning before the violence is done very covertly, very privately, and the person is incredibly focused. They're not reactive, they are very focused, and that's part of what makes them so dangerous. So I want to recommend a book for you here. The book is called The Anatomy of Violence by Adrian Rain. It's published back in April of 2013. It's really based looking at different brain images from the university, from Stanford University brain scan study going on for 4 decades now. And these are primarily PET scans. So what you see is perhaps you and I at the far left end of this image, and we're the control group. And you see blood distributed equally, activation of the brain, and the frontal part of the brain, that's the top of the slide, behind the eyes, again, prefrontal cortex, all kinds of executive thought. The back of the brain, the doing part of the brain, the limbic system, the autonomic nervous system, all again lit up as well. But when we move to the far opposite end of the slide, you see affective violence. That is the predator. That's the affective violence is you or I, rather, and that's someone who just loses it in the moment because you're so upset. You see the prefrontal parts of the brain essentially go dark, and you see very little activation. The back of the brain, the doing part of the brain, is still very active, still very lit up. And we don't remember what we did, we don't remember what we said, we're not really focused or thinking in the moment. The thing that makes the predator so dangerous, and that's the image in the center of the slide, is that they're still totally with it. They're still very present, they're still very conscious, they're still very goal-driven and focused, they're very in the moment, and they have all their wits about them during these acts of terrible violence. So that's one of the real distinguishing features, and we see a lot of that when we do actually look at studies of psychopaths and understand the same structure, the personality level, the brain science level, of seeing other people as objects, of having no remorse, of having no empathy, and a willingness to use violence as a problem-solving tool. The same person who's extremely narcissistic, extremely entitled, who just doesn't connect with other people in the same way. Now, for probably, I want to say about 10 years or more now, probably back to about 2011, in the behavioral sciences, we've been talking about warning behaviors as opposed to just warning signs. Warning behaviors, though, very specifically of a lone actor or a violent true believer on the pathway to this sort of predatory violence. And there's what we refer to as 18 warning behaviors that tell us 3 things. They tell us that someone is on a pathway to violence, they tell us where they are, and they tell us if they're accelerating. Those are all 3 important indicators. They're patterns of behavior. And colleagues of mine like Dr. Reed Malloy in San Diego and others have published this. We've shared this with our partners in the law enforcement and the intelligence community. And I want to introduce you to those 18 indicators. They're broken into 2 categories known as proximal, near-term, and distal, long-term indicators. And you could think of this akin to the weather, looking at the weather forecast. And the weather forecaster may tell us that we have a storm warning, and that tells us it's right here. You need to get to the basement and batten the hatches because we're going to have this. It's near-term. Distal factors mean the conditions exist. We may have that storm, we may have that tornado, but it's not absolute. It's not for sure, but you need to keep an eye on it. A watch requires immediate action. A warning requires that we keep our eye on this and we monitor it. Now, in the proximal range, there are 8 well-established, and again, there's good empirical research behind this. And you could go actually to Dr. Malloy's website, drreedmalloy.com, in the section called Publications. At no cost, you can pull down all of the journal articles that support these 8 pathway ideas. The first of these is pathway, and that's any sort of activity preparing for an attack, research or planning, acquiring equipment, going to the range, training with my militia in the woods, buying precursor materials for explosives, any of these kind of things. Someone's getting ready, right? So this is a very significant step on the pathway. Very likely to see in clinical practice is what we refer to as fixation. Fixation, and these are important words, increasing, and so over time it's getting worse, pathological preoccupation with a person or a cause. But this is not to be confused with a romantic fixation. This is not like stalking. It's not believe the person thinks that this is a love interest. This is angry. This is the person constantly perseverating about this. Their opinion becomes more rigid, more strident, more fixed over time, and it starts to take a toll on their home life, their work, their studies. It comes at a cost because they're starting to damage relationships because they're so strident and so angry about this. It's angry emotion that continues to worsen. Now, I kid around and I say the way you could tell a person who meets this kind of this pattern of behavior is based on how many bumper stickers they have on the back of their car. Of course, I'm only kidding about that, but some people want to tell you their entire worldview while you're sitting behind them at a red light. So here, this fixation is one of our known indicators. Very important is one I touched on earlier, identification, where the individual sees themselves as a warrior, as a militarized combatant on behalf of their belief or cause. We refer to this sometimes as a pseudo-commando. This is Anders Breivik in the photograph. Breivik, who I mentioned in terms of the attack in Utoya Island. Folks, if you don't remember this, this is, again, on July 11th, actually, I believe it was 2015. I think I have my date wrong there. Breivik, after detonating a car bomb in the business or the government district of Oslo, takes a ferry to a summer camp, a youth summer camp on Utoya Island, and shoots and kills 69 teenagers there. Killed 7 or 8 rather in the bomb blast in Oslo. So a very, very significant casualty count. Breivik, who surrendered to police there, said he'd been planning this for 7 years and actually saw himself as part of a lineage going back to the Knights Templar, to the Crusades, trying to protect Europe against an invasion of Muslim immigrants. So we see this idea of being part of this military tradition. And he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't a law enforcement officer. He had his mom sewing him these uniforms, had her convinced he was into cosplay or role play, and was making him these beautiful uniforms. And again, a lengthy manifesto defending his justification. Same idea if we look at the far, another sort of group, maybe a group that derives their moral authority from the Constitution, who believes that their lineage goes back to the patriots in the United States for the American Revolution, back to Concord and Lexington in the 1700s. So this individual typically is fascinated with military or police uniforms, paraphernalia, adopts the hairstyles, the speech, the clothing, and really presents as kind of this militarized sort of person, even though they're not necessarily associated. Novel aggression is also sometimes referred as proof of kill. Proof of kill means the person is going out before a major attack to kill someone or hurt someone as a way of proving to themselves they really can do it. They have the stuff. Example of this would be the older of the 2 brothers in the Boston bombing was actually implicated in 2 homicides after the fact, one in Miami and one in Waltham, Massachusetts, in which it seems he was part of murder just to prove to himself he could do this prior to launching the attack on Patriots Day at the Boston Marathon. Energy burst is a unipolar burst. Now, many of us have been trained over time that whenever we see a notable increase or decrease in behavior, it's significant, and it could be indicative even of something like suicide risk. In this realm of lone actor violence, we see usually a unipolar burst of activity in the hours and days before an event. What we see, and this is a case example of Michael McDermott. McDermott had a fixed delusion. He worked as a computer programmer. You're starting to really feel badly about computer programmers, I know. But he's a computer programmer at Edgewater Technology in Wakefield, Massachusetts, who has this long-held delusion that he's being cheated out of his pay by his bosses, his coworkers, by everyone around him. He's gone to his boss 100 times plus to ask why he's being cheated, and his boss has told him, Michael, your wages are being garnished for back taxes. This is a court order. We have to adhere to this. But Michael feels even the letters from the court are part of this conspiracy against him. And no one at this point will even listen to his complaints anymore. The day after Christmas in 2000, he comes to work that day happy as a clam, despite the fact for months he hasn't spoken to anybody at work at all. He's moved his desk. He sits in a corner. He gives everyone the most angry, hostile glares and stares as they walk by. He's just a totally toxic person. But today he comes to work happy as a clam. We see that big energy burst, and everyone sees this, and everyone's made uncomfortable by this, but they don't know what to make out of it. On lunch break, he goes out to his vehicle in the parking lot, comes back with 2 loaded handguns and shoots and kills 7 coworkers. So in the hours before this delusion-inspired violence, we see this big burst of animation, this big burst of affect, that he's in a whole different space. Now, very common is the warning behavior of leakage. Leakage is telling third parties, and what happens most often today is usually in social media posts, but it's telling other people. Very significant in our study, 67% of adults, 58% of adolescents, in the third study by Dr. O'Toole with a smaller n, 100% of the shooters in that study had clearly told other people what they intended to do. An example of this would be very easy to find in Google Images, perhaps, a screenshot of the Instagram from Nicholas Cruz, the school shooter in Parkland, Florida, who had posted an Instagram verbatim, "I'm going to be a professional school shooter." We could look at the videos recorded by Elliot Rodger, the famous incel shooter in Santa Barbara, California, who was, again, just leaking this information everywhere about his intention to commit mass violence. Now, what's changed over time is back, for example, in the Columbine era, we would see people making a hit list or writing on the school notebook cover, things of this nature, bleeding or leaking in these ways. Today, as I said, the themes of the leakage are very consistent: despair, hopelessness, helplessness, really no purpose to go on in life, but it's communicated typically in these online sort of venues. The last 2 of these, very quickly: direct communication. Party A tells Party B about their hostile intent, their intention to kill that target. And the last of these is last resort behavior, in which the person feels there is no other way. They've exhausted all alternatives to violence, and the only way, and this again is very common when there's an active delusion, that there's no other way but to stop the threat through the use of physical force or violence themselves. Now, I'm not going to belabor each of the distal indicators, but I did mention a few of them along the way. Many of these violent actors have themselves had mental disorders. Many have failure in intimate bonding, can't really form relationships well. Many, again, are dependent on a virtual community where primarily their contact with the world is through other like-minded people online. When we are looking and listening, not as necessarily a formal threat assessment, that's not the focus of our conversation today, but we're always looking in a balanced way of both strengths and vulnerabilities, what I'm going to refer to as inhibiting factors and facilitating factors. Facilitating factors are things that may move someone closer to violence. Inhibiting factors are something that moves someone away from violence. We need, in fairness and in clinical accuracy, to be listening and assessing for both. So we're listening for strengths and coping mechanisms. Is there a healthy ego structure? Is there health in terms of coping? Are there good defenses in place? How resilient is this person and tolerant to change? We're looking on the other side for negative traits like rigidity and impulsivity, irrational thinking, low levels of empathy, and so forth. We're listening to self-perception, feelings about narcissism and grandiosity and so forth. Listening for themes of really attention-seeking, recognition, and notoriety, relationships to authority, preoccupations with violence, and so forth. And we're also assessing for strengths. These are those protective factors I referred to as inhibiting factors. A sense of connection to a good, strong, solid internal belief system, something, again, that's based in reality, that's pro-social, to others in the community, to organizations that are pro-social, that give people a positive and meaningful way to belong, to contribute to the world and society. That is where I'm going to end it today with this final thought closing out, because I know this can be dark stuff. We've just gone through a very, very difficult year. As I mentioned, not just with the pandemic and the kind of political and social environment that we've been in, with the other major events I've mentioned, ranging from wildfires to storms and such. It's easy to kind of get ourselves stuck, really just absorbed with some of the more negative events of the world around us today. I finished with this quote from Napoleon, who had said, "There's only two forces in the world, the sword and the spirit, and ultimately the sword will always be conquered by the spirit." So even during, what can be very trying times, it's important for us, for our own health and those around us, and for those that you serve, that we keep the proper framework, keep our heads and our chins up, and understand that the good is prevailing and will continue to prevail. But there will be people, for a number of reasons, who get pulled down these rabbit holes. And we may be in positions to recognize that, in positions to divert them to, as I said, off ramps and safer ways to really deal with their challenges rather than violence or extremism. So I want to thank you very much for your attention to the presentation. You have a number of ways to contact me here. As I said, I'm happy to answer questions, connect you to more resources, but I want to thank you very much for participating in this program. Be well, be safe, and hope to see you again in additional or future trainings. Bye-bye.